All right, so hopefully you guys had an opportunity to find the Chapter 6 guided notes if you choose to use those. You may have noted that they're incomplete, and so I gave us enough to at least get through today. And then I'll update those before Tuesday for your access. And so just like we've done in the past, we're going to start out with understanding what the heck we're going to study in this chapter. We should be able to see a theme by now. Our objectives are what are covered in the chapter content, which are covered in the chapter review questions, which are covered in the respective unit exam. And so that might be a good study method for you, is to take your test and go back and align it with your objectives and your study guide so that you can kind of craft your studying, if you will, for the remaining two exams. In this sixth chapter, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. And so we're going to talk about endocrine glands. And we're going to differentiate a primary endocrine gland from that of a secondary endocrine gland. The name alone might kind of give you some bit of information, but we'll clarify that today. And then we're going to look at some major, I think mostly primary endocrine glands, their targets and primary effects, and how those hormones are regulated. So we're getting into hormonal pathways. Just like we looked at nerve pathways in the previous chapter, now we're looking at hormonal pathways and how they control their targets. We're also going to study quite a bit, and today in particular, the anatomical relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, as well as the posterior pituitary. The structure dictates our function, right? So we'll tie that in there as well. We're going to utilize this term tropic, which you became familiar with from your worksheet 6 for our lab this week. And so we'll give a proper definition and give some examples. And then today we're going to introduce a concept, realizing that there's not just a single hormone present in the body at a given time. There's multiple. And we're going to say what happens when multiples of those interact on the same target cell at the same time. And some terminology that we're going to use includes synergistic, permissive, and antagonistic relationships. Those are our goals. They may be not familiar yet, but hopefully by the end of today, quite a bit of these objectives are met. At the start of your guided notes, I have a couple of reminders. Okay, so don't forget, whole point of this class, if we're trying to maintain what? Homeostasis. There's got to be some receptor, there's got to be some control center, and there has to be some effector. Trying to maintain homeostasis and set point. So we can't dump all that stuff just because we're in the endocrine system. It's extremely relevant here as well. So don't forget that. We also can't forget all the ground that we made covering Chapter 5, had a test over previously, and the role of extracellular messengers. Right? One of the questions on your test were name at least 3 different types of messengers, and you should have said neurotransmitters, hormones, neurohormones, paracrine, autocrine, something like that, right? Hormones are a type of extracellular messenger. That means this is indirect cell-to-cell communication. Because they're extracellular, we have to take into consideration the solubility of the hormone. Is it what? Is it what? Our options would be, is it more hydrophilic or is it more lipophilic? That'll tell us where the receptors are at the target cell. It'll tell us an idea, the effect at the target cell, right? What's going on. So don't lose that ground either. And just, I've got a few picture images to kind of solidify what we just spoke about. We know that hormones are produced by endocrine glands, and they're extracellular messenger. Hormones go into the bloodstream. That's what makes an endocrine gland unique, in that its product goes into the circulatory system, and that the target is distant. It may be the messenger, for example, is coming from the pituitary gland. It may be trying to target something far away, like the ovaries, right? So it's got a long way to travel. But what will be common is the target still must have a receptor, right, to do some whatever job that hormone tells that cell to do. I'll get into specifics in a little bit. A couple of pictorial images as well. We're also going to talk about neurohormones. We already saw some neurohormones. That'd be another type of extracellular messenger. What characterizes neurohormone?
Comes from a nerve cell and enters the bloodstream.
Comes from a nerve cell, and the messenger is transported in the blood to target a distant cell, I guess, distant target. Comes from a nerve, neuro, but we give the throwing the suffix the hormone because it goes into the bloodstream. So we're going to talk about hormones, neurohormones. We also talked about the solubility of the messengers. We already just discussed it's something more lipid soluble. It will need a transport protein in the circulatory system. We also know that the target would have an intracellular receptor. By contrast, as we mentioned a moment ago, hydrophilic messengers. Same thing for hormones. If they're going to the blood, they've got to be exocytosed. But we noted that our hydrophilic messengers don't need an extra transporter to get them from point A to point B. They're already water soluble. All right, so all this is a review from Chapter 5. And we can also include in there the role of the receptors. You know that receptors are built differently to do what differently? Function differently. So some of our receptors may be like what's shown here. What kind of receptor is shown here? One that activates it is G protein bound and it activates the second messenger pathway. And this one specifically, the cyclic AMP pathway. They may just be activating gated ion channels. They promote transcription, right? Keep going on with some variations. And we'll look at specific pathways coming up. Those are our reviews. Before we move on, what questions do you have about that Chapter 5 ground that we made a month ago? I want to show a brief video just to introduce the endocrine system, where some glands are located, and some primary function of hormones. You don't have to take notes. Certainly we're going to hit these pathways. That's the point of the next couple of lectures.
About a dozen major glands make up the endocrine system. Most secrete hormones, chemical messengers with specific jobs to do. So far, scientists have identified more than 100 different hormones produced by the endocrine glands. We can look at them in their crystal form. They are beautiful and vital to our lives. Some hormones are produced in the brain, the pancreas, our reproductive organs, and our thyroid. Hormones are carried to every part of the body by the bloodstream, where certain target cells respond to hormonal commands. The pituitary gland in our brain produces hormones to direct our growth and sexual maturity. This little gland with a big job is often referred to as the master gland because its chemistry triggers the work of other glands lower in the body. At the pituitary signal, our reproductive organs produce testosterone and estrogen, seen here in crystal form. They control our sexual development. The little master gland gets us going every morning, too. Each day, the pituitary directs a pair of adrenal glands sitting atop our kidneys to produce a dose of cortisol, a wake-up hormone that provides a boost of energy. As cortisol wears off, the adrenal gland produces adrenaline and noradrenaline, hormones controlling fear and anger, to help us meet more stressful challenges of the day. Firefighters may produce a fair amount of adrenaline. In the face of danger, adrenaline gets us to breathe deeper and tense our muscles, priming our bodies for action. All that activity produces wear and tear. We need to replace about 1/2 pound of muscle and tissue every day. That's a job for the thyroid gland, which helps control the rate at which we process food and burn fat. But it's the pancreas gland, located behind the stomach, that produces hormones that help us regulate our sugar highs and lows. It pours insulin into our blood after a meal, instructing the liver to take excess sugar and store it until we need a boost. In those hungry hours between meals, the pancreas eases up on insulin and increases the flow of glucagon, another hormone that directs the liver to release some of the stored sugar loose into the bloodstream. As night approaches, the production of adrenaline slows and we get sleepy. Overnight, the pituitary gland goes back to work, using growth hormones to repair the damages of the day, and the chemical clock starts another cycle.
All right, so just a little survey introduction into the endocrine system. Before we can look at specific pathways, we've got to use some terminology, get familiar with some of it. So yes?
If I go to Discovery, I can review that, right?
I don't know that that's available to the public. That's an education resource. But you can, after I download it online, you can check it out on YouTube. All right, so if we look at the endocrine system itself, right, we have unique organs for unique function. If we compare it to the nervous system, though, if you remember the nervous system, we had some distinct things like the brain, the spinal cord, your cranial nerves, and your spinal nerves, right? So you could do it in a dissection. You could really see the brain and spinal cord, etc. You could also dissect and find the endocrine glands as well, but they're going to be more small and spread out throughout the body, and certainly not physically connected like the cells of your nervous system organs are. And so they're throughout the body. They're even in, like we saw in the brain, in the central nervous system. Some important glands that we have, whose main job is to secrete hormones, we will call those primary endocrine glands or primary endocrine organs. Primary endocrine organs, their primary job is to do what? Secrete hormones. If a gland is considered to be a primary endocrine gland, its main job, maybe not its only job, but its main job is to produce hormones and secrete them into the blood. Some examples of primary endocrine glands include the pineal gland, the pituitary gland is probably maybe the most famous one, endocrine gland. The thyroid as well, a lot of people are familiar with that, located in the neck. The thymus, located behind the sternum, certainly has some endocrine function. And we already became familiar with the with the adrenal medulla at the end of the sympathetic nervous system discussion. Another gland that you're probably familiar with includes the pancreas, which secretes which hormones? Insulin. You might know the antagonistic hormone to insulin. Glucagon. Glucagon. Something to do with sugar, right? Your textbook has classified the ovaries and the testes as primary endocrine glands. I guess this could be one that you could debate over. I would put those into secondary endocrine glands. What do you think? What do you think? I think the primary job of the testes or the ovaries are. Well, yes, in what fashion though? Because the endocrine system is important for reproduction. What fashion, besides endocrine function, do you think the ovaries and testes have?
Give off the testosterone.
Well, so hormones would be endocrines. I'm saying, what else would they do besides hormone production? Production and storage of and release of our gametes. Testes make sperm. Ovaries make eggs. Right? And so I myself would say, well, that's probably the primary job of the ovaries and testes is to make the gametes.
Aren't those made pretty much before you're born? Like eggs?
The stem cells are. The oocytes, in the female, the oocytes are, but not true in the male. Okay, so the male, although he also has stem cells ready to go, they're not divided. I mean, they just continually throughout the male's life are producing new gametes. And so if the testes can't make gametes, it seems to me a moot point about the hormone production for reproduction. So I think it's one thing that you could debate over. They're saying primary. I said, I would call it a secondary endocrine organ. But some things there's no argument over. Right? Pituitary is an endocrine gland, etc. And keep going through this list. Also really cool, the placenta, you may not have thought about it as being having the ability to secrete hormones, and it does, and that's how during pregnancy the fetus can talk, if you will, with the maternal uterus to say, hey, keep on, keep it on, keep me developing. So that certainly does have some hormone production ability. So we have primary endocrine glands, so we must have secondary endocrine glands. How could we define a secondary endocrine gland?
The main job is it to produce hormones?
Very good. Organs whose main job is not to produce hormones, is to do something else. But they do retain the ability to produce hormones. They can release hormones, but that's not their job, their primary job.
You said they can produce too.
They can produce hormones. They can produce and release hormones, but that's not their main job. So they have an endocrine function, but that's not what they're most well associated with. That's not their main job, main function. A great example of a secondary endocrine organ would be your heart. When you think about the heart, do you think about hormone production? Have you ever probably thought about it? No. But the heart does have the ability to produce a hormone called ANP. We'll talk about it in the 4th unit, atrial natriuretic peptide. But what do you think the main job of the heart is? Pumping blood. But it does have endocrine function, so we would call it a secondary endocrine gland. Stomach can also produce hormones, liver, kidney. We'll study the kidney hormone at the end of the semester as well. What questions do you have about the difference between a primary versus secondary endocrine gland? Should be figure 6.1 in your textbook. If you need a reference somewhere around there, start of the chapter, I'll have these discussions. I'm sorry? The placenta, the question was, is the placenta's job a secondary or primary? Yeah, I'm trying to walk through it. I can see how you think it's secondary, but without that hormone talk, the pregnancy may terminate. But yeah, the placenta is there to provide just a boundary, if you will, but also nutrients and weight, all those kinds of things that go along with it. But without the hormones, the pregnancy would terminate, and so I think it's important.
How will we see it as secondary just because it's not there all the time?
Well, whether it's there all the time or not, it's there. So when it's there, what is its main job?
Right.
Just going on that, you wouldn't categorize that because men don't have a placenta. Okay, so well, what is the placenta's job? It does produce hormones for the pregnancy maintenance and then boundaries and litany of things. It's very important for fetal development. Okay. Additional questions or discussion? All right. So we're okay with the difference between a primary versus a secondary endocrine gland. We can also now talk about our hormones, how they may be controlled for release. This should go right back to what we studied in Chapter 1, the extrinsic factors for maintaining homeostasis. We said nerves, we said hormones, and we said blood factors, right? And that is summarized here as well. Our hormones are certainly extrinsically regulated by the nervous system, by other hormones, and by factors in the blood. You can concisely say neural regulation. What does that mean? A nerve will stimulate its release. So endocrine glands can respond to nerves. We've got a great example shown in this image. What is this? Did I show an image of this before? What is that? The adrenal gland. Which nervous system can stimulate the adrenal medulla? Which nervous system can activate the adrenal medulla?
Central.
Sympathetic nervous system. Okay, the sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight mechanism, can tell the adrenal medulla to release which neurohormones? Epinephrine or adrenaline into the blood. For widespread diffuse effects, the top question on the back of the test, because the epinephrine goes into the blood, has long-lasting effects, takes a long time to metabolize. All right, so the nervous system can control the release of some hormones. Let me go to the third scenario. Tropic. You're in a lab. What does that mean? If you've been in a lab or remember doing your pre-lab. Tropic means?
It like secretes in order for something else to secrete.
What is secreted? A
Hormone.
hormone controls the release of another hormone. So tropic, T-R-O-P-H-I-C, with or without the I, with or without the H, you can say tropic, tropic. Both are acceptable. I think with the H is European, without it is us, American. So, I throw the H in there because when I see tropic, my mind deviates to be, So I throw the H in there to keep it on task. So if a endocrine gland is activated tropically, we would say another hormone, turn it on or turn it off. So tropic regulation of an endocrine gland means that the endocrine gland is controlled by another hormone, by a different hormone. That makes sense, because I said our major extrinsic controllers are the nervous system and the endocrine system. Ties right in here to the endocrine system as well. We also said that some things can be controlled humorally. What does that mean? The blood. Something in the blood that's not a neurotransmitter, that's not a hormone, something in the blood can activate a gland to release its products. We say humoral regulation. An example is shown in this image are the parathyroid glands. They release a hormone called parathyroid hormone. In response to which humoral factor? You can read the image. Can you all read it by chance? What is that?
Calcium.
Calcium. Blood calcium. What type of levels? Low blood calcium activates the parathyroid gland humorally. So the low blood calcium is a humoral stimulus to the parathyroids to release this hormone called parathyroid hormone. What do you think probably the effect of parathyroid hormone is?
In weight.
Parathyroid hormone, it responds to low calcium, increased calcium back to that point, in normal. So another example you're probably more familiar with, you just not used the term before, humoral, would be your blood glucose, your blood sugar. Sugar is not a neurotransmitter. Sugar is not a hormone, but it's circulated in the blood and monitored by your, which organ? Pancreas. Your blood sugar is elevated. The pancreas is humorally regulated by these humoral levels of sugar. So if my blood sugar becomes too high, the pancreas will release insulin. And then maybe my blood sugar will drop. Pancreas still humorally regulated by this declining glucose. So which hormone would be activated? The antagonistic one? Glucagon. Insulin would be turned off. Glucagon would be released. We'll look at those pathways in a little bit. But what I'm trying to illustrate is something in the blood can regulate the release of some other particular hormone. It doesn't have to be a neurotransmitter. It doesn't have to be a hormone. It can be something else in the blood. And we could do generic and say that's humoral. Yes?
Are we saying that the control of the hormone, all of them, is a neural regulation?
No, we're saying it may be neural, it may be humoral, or it may be tropic. It may be one of the three. The title wrong?
No.
So yeah, it's not all just neural. not all just tropic. There's some humoral factors as well. What questions do you have about differentiating using the term neural for nerve, tropic for hormone, or humoral for blood? You may recall as well, I mentioned a moment ago that we don't have just one hormone in our blood at any given time, right? We may have a multitude of all of our hormones present at any time because our target cells respond to not just one hormone and not one just neurotransmitter, etc. We've got to look at the combined effects of some hormones and how do they, if both are present, what's their effect at the target? And we can use some terminology. The first terminology that we can use, if multiple hormones are present at a single target cell, and if that's not clarified in the title, go ahead and do so. Multiple hormones, or circle the S, hormones, multiple types of hormones at a single target cell. We're going to say, well, what is, if hormone A and hormone B are together at the target cell, what's the net, or how do they affect the target cell? There's really three options. No change, enhance, or decrease, right? So we're going to summarize those. If two hormones are considered to be permissive, what do you think?
Oh, they work together? No.
You got two
They
of the
allow each other.
There's going to be a, we got the word allow and need that were posed. There's a difference in the way I was, I guess, trained, if you will, using this terminology versus the way that your textbook uses the term permissive, and I'll tell you both ways. And the little images that I have shown here will kind of illustrate the two hormones at a target cell. I'll give you your book definition. Your book definition says that when two hormones are present and they're permissive, it says they need one another to have an effect. It says they're reliant upon one another. That's what your book says. I'm going to strike the need part. Okay? Here's what I'm going to say, permissiveness, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong with this is what I understand. Okay? What I understand that permissive hormones are is that when both are present, I'm going to strike the need. When both are present, each hormone can do its own command, if you will. There's no added benefit of both hormones being present. There's no net loss, if you will, of both hormones being present. So pick a hormone, say epinephrine, and pick another hormone. Might be permissive with epinephrine. Do what?
Adrenaline.
Epinephrine is adrenaline. So I would say they would be the same messenger, but like insulin and parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has something to do with what? Calcium. Epinephrine has to do with excitation, energy use, etc. So I would say maybe epinephrine and calcitonin, if they're acting on a cell at the same time. Epinephrine's doing its thing at the target cell. Calcitonin's doing its thing at the target cell. They're not helping or hindering each other. They're independent. I would say permissive.
So they act independently.
Yes, at the same time. If both are present. No, that's where I in the book disagree.
Okay.
We're saying, well, they are present. They're epinephrine's promoting muscle contraction, parathyroid hormones promoting calcium release.
So basically, they're both doing their job and they're not relying upon each other.
That's the way I would define it. She said both are doing their job, but they're not relying upon one another, but they're both present. They're there at the same time. It would be like you and I in this classroom. I hear my job is to facilitate the instruction, right? Well, no. No, yeah, okay. Let's say I'm in here and I'm not going to be a good example because you would be, not necessarily, okay? So I can come in here and talk, right? And you can go sit in there and you can learn. You can sit in there and learn if I come and talk or not, right? So you can read your book or whatever. Not a great example, but I just came up. So.
Well, I kind of understand what you're saying. It's like we're all in the same room doing physiology, but the difference is you came to teach, but we came to learn.
Right.
So that's what it's like.
Right. That's kind of where I was going.
We're still going to learn. You're still going to teach, and it's not going to affect anything.
Well,
We're still going to do our job.
we're going to strike for. Hopefully, I'm an effective teacher, and we go into the next scenario, and that together actually. I would hope that we would have a synergistic effect. Okay, so we'll use permissive to the teacher that just says, read the book, take the test. You read the book, you take the test, they told you. But me, in my class, we have such an exciting class that not only do you read the book on your own, we're both present, and your learning is enhanced. I'm a synergist. Hopefully we have a synergistic relationship. We'll go with that. So in a synergistic relationship, two hormones are present, and their effect is enhanced. I could teach without you, you could learn without me, but we together as a team, the enhanced output is greater. Hormones, they don't teach and learn, but they work together. And the effect is amplified, enhanced. Some examples of synergistic hormones, you could talk about a hormone called growth hormone. You can abbreviate it GH. Growth hormone and the hormone you're studying in lab this week. Which hormone are you studying in lab that might be synergistic with growth hormone? Thyroxine. Thyroxine enhances metabolism. Growth hormone probably also enhances metabolism. Synergistic. So hormones may be permissive. Hormones may be synergistic together. They may also be what? Antagonist to one another. What does that mean?
One's working at the expense of the other.
Not necessarily at the expense per se, but at what? Against or opposed one another. I wouldn't say any competition is going on, but their actions are opposite. So I used the word antagonistic a moment ago to kind of set you up for now. Which two antagonistic hormones did I spout out a moment ago? Those actually would be synergistic. Insulin and glucagon are antagonistic. Insulin does what to our blood sugar? Lowers it, takes it from the blood and stores it. Glucagon, if it's antagonistic, must elevate your blood sugar back to that point.
So we could say one opposes.
Their effects are opposite. Another example of a pair of antagonistic hormones, parathyroid hormone. Do you remember what it does? Something to do with calcium, calcium bringing it up. Okay, you know that parathyroid hormone elevates our blood calcium levels to set point. Now I could say calcitonin is antagonistic to parathyroid hormone. You don't even know the pathway. You don't even know where it comes from. You know what calcitonin does. What does it do? Decreases our blood calcium back to that point. You okay in the terminology? Antagonistic, opposite one another. Any questions or clarification before we move on?
Can you repeat the example for permissiveness?
Permissiveness, I just picked two. I picked epinephrine and what else did I pick? Calcitonin or something like that. It either goes into your bones for storage, or it's just not absorbed in the digestive system, or it's secreted out through the renal system. And we'll look at that pathway. Probably not today, but certainly next week. Very good. So we can store calcium in our bones, and calcitonin can regulate that. All right, additional questions? All right, so before we get into the pathways, we need to address when the endocrine system goes awry, or we have diseases or disorders. We won't have the pleasure, if you will, talking about diseases. I think that's the cool part about the endocrine system, unless you have an endocrine system disorder, so that's so cool. But it's neat to see, right, kind of the disturbance that can happen in the body when the endocrine system is out of disorder. And so there's two primary reasons the endocrine system may not be functioning properly. And it goes back to just the amount of messenger. Is the amount of messenger in set point level, so we have homeostasis, or are the blood levels of the hormones too low, or the blood levels of the hormone too high? So certainly a hormone could be undersecreted for various reasons. Maybe you had a surgery and it got cut out. Thyroid cancer, right? Thyroid gland removed, and now your thyroxine levels are null. Right? Could be a dietary problem, right? For example, right? There could be an immune problem. It could be genetically speaking. You and your family, you've known for decades that everybody in your family undersecretes insulin. It's just genetic. Right? There may be a reason. And the same thing would happen for hypersecretion as well. We can oversecrete endocrine glands. Excessive hypersecretion of hormones is usually due to probably a tumor, whether it's cancerous or not. There's something growing and pushing and activating those cells too much. How do you think you could fix, if you're a doctor and you have a patient and they're undersecreting a hormone, pick your hormone, how could you treat them?
Medication.
Just give them a drug. Give them the hormone that they're missing, and hopefully they'll bring it back up to that point.
Can you also give them a, let's see, you want more, you said, right?
Yeah, if I'm undersecreting something,
Okay, so a blocker wouldn't help, right? Okay.
no, a blocker would actually make it worse.
Yeah.
If you're blocking that particular hormone that's not being produced or at that level. So a hyposecreted hormone just undersecreted. And so giving medical ability, funds, right, etc., you can replace the hormone and hopefully bring back the set point. The delivery, whether it be a pill or an injection or whatever, depends on the hormone and its solubility and half-life and etc.
What goes on with giants?
We're going to talk about gigantism a little bit. It is a disorder, and it's due to an excessive of growth hormone from the pituitary. And so that one, you can't reverse those effects. In that case, the growth hormone would have been hypersecreted.
Because they do sometimes have tumors in the pituitary.
Gigantism may be just hereditary, but a lot of them are pituitary tumors, gone untreated. And so it is growing. You know, it might seem good to be a giant in the world, but being a giant has its physical, right, complications with it. Yeah, it's not good on the body. So if something's being hypersecreted, what can we do? How can we slow it down? Give an antagonist drug. So in that case, you would want to give a blocker, right, if you will. What else could you do? Remove the gland. If it's just uncontrolled with the drug, and then a person will become. And you gotta give them a drug. Yes. Either way, you're getting some medicine, right? All right, so it may be just poor concentrations of the messenger. But we can't forget about the what? The target. Target may be not working properly through receptors or whatever, fill in the blank, they're built wrong, whatever. So an endocrine disorder may not be the source, maybe the target why you're not having a response. So, as mentioned a moment ago, this is the cool part. We talk about gigantism, diabetes, right? Fill in the blank. But we've got to understand how things work normally first before we start looking at the disease state. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some specific glands. Yes?
What would be wrong with your thyroid to where you have to take, I think the medication called Synthroid?
If you're taking a medication to mimic a hormone, you're hypothyroid. Yeah. Hypothyroidism is quite common to middle-aged women. Just another one of those things of being a woman. Get to enjoy. So, just low secretion or, again, thyroidism. So we're going to look at some specific glands and some hormones. And we're going to look at a few. Hopefully you'll see a theme. The table that I have in your notes is consistent as well, pretty consistent. We are going to look at, for each gland, the hormone or hormones. So that tells us some glands may produce more than one type of hormone. So we're going to look at some primary. We're not going to look at all. It'll feel like that we're looking at them all. We're not going to look at all of the hormones. We're going to look at quite a few hormones from some glands. We're going to look at, we might want to clarify this, the primary regulator or regulators. So some hormones are controlled by more than one type of factor, humoral, neural, tropic, whatever. We're going to look at the main regulators, main, primary, most common. And we're also going to study the primary targets, and the primary target functions. Notice I again use the word primary, main. We're going to look at the more well-characterized functions. So we're going to get a survey, if you will. We're not going to look at, well, what does this do in a 49-year-old man and, whatever. Okay, so we're saying, well, this generally does this. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because some hormones are more associated with one gender than the other, but you find them of both genders. Okay, so classic example, when I say estrogen, you think female, but human male has more estrogen in it than it does a cow out in the field. Okay, so they still have estrogen, and they have a lot of it, but just not as much as a female, a woman. Same thing about oxytocin. When I say oxytocin, you think very okay. You think woman, right? Her, the baby, etc., right? But men also have oxytocin. I say prolactin, you're probably thinking about lactation, but still also men have, right? Prolactin. Okay, so we're going to look at the primary sources, the primary targets, the primary target responses. We're not going to be completely inclusive.
So do we have testosterone?
Yeah, women have testosterone. Definitely.
You have to have it for something.
Yeah.
There's something different
Yeah.
about
So, yeah, we've got both. Same thing with testosterone. Ladies have testosterone. It's really important for early, right, maturation.
If too much of it causes like excessive arm or.
Yeah, same thing. If you hypersecrete testosterone for your gender, more masculinizing. If you're a male and you hypersecrete estrogen, more feminizing features, right? We could keep going on with hyper examples. And so we're going to look at some glands and their major function. First glands, we're going to start with going back to the familiar structure of the brain. You should have an actual memory of looking at the hypothalamus and looking at the pituitary gland from our sheep brain dissections earlier in the semester. You may recall that your brain didn't look anything like this, did it? It was all squished and whatever. You're like, oh, that's the hypothalamus. You're just trusting me, right? Hopefully. And then we noted on the underside, we saw the pituitary gland. You may have noted the pituitary gland had a lot of blood vessels. It was real dark looking because the pituitary gland secretes hormones into the blood. Okay, so it's well vascularized. So we're going back to the brain. We're going to look at the hypothalamus. We studied it as being like the most important regulator for homeostasis. So not only does it have neural control, like we saw in the previous chapter, unit, but it also has neurohormone function as well. So we're going to zoom in and look at how the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland work together. So in this next image, figure 6.2b, is kind of zooming in, looking at this relationship. So I'm going to point out a couple of things. hypothalamus is, what type of cells are in the hypothalamus? Nerves. Nerves make up our central nervous system. The hypothalamus is in the central nervous system. So we're going to have some, we're going to make you cry, but we can't stop talking about the nervous system, okay? Even here in the endocrine system. And so same thing, receptors, set point, threshold, neurotransmitter, etc. Axons, axon terminals, all that. Okay. So we're going to look at some cells of the hypothalamus and how they are anatomically and functionally connected to the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. I'm going to first look at the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus, we could call it a neural structure. We could call it a neuroendocrine gland. I'll probably refer to it more as a neuroendocrine gland now that we're in the endocrine system proper. So it produces neurohormones. That tells us these things are going to, messengers are going to go into the bloodstream. These neurohormones, depending on which one you're looking at, may be directly secreted from the posterior pituitary. Because the posterior pituitary is just the axon terminals of cells that originate in the hypothalamus. So some cells of the hypothalamus just extend and they actually make up the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is nerve axon terminals of cells that originated in the hypothalamus. So just got little nerve axon terminals. What's down there in our terminals? What's in our nerve? There are some voltage-gated channels and vesicles with neurohormones, neurotransmitter. So the posterior pituitary is just axon terminals of cells in the hypothalamus. That tells us the posterior pituitary can secrete neurohormones made in the hypothalamus. That's not all that it does, though. It also secretes neurohormones that tropically regulate the anterior pituitary. Neurohormones tropically regulate the anterior pituitary. So what does the term tropic imply? A hormone controls this, so the hypothalamus has to release its neurohormones into the blood, then that targets the anterior pituitary. We're going to see nerve something in the posterior pituitary, hormone something in the anterior pituitary. We'll back this up with some images right on your guided notes. So let's first look at the posterior pituitary and the relationship with the hypothalamus. You make reference to figure 6.3 in your textbook. Now we're adding a layer to the previous image, and we can see some nerve cells. What color are they? The yellow things. We can see the cell bodies in the hypothalamus. Very good. The axons travel through an area called the infundibulum. It's just nerve axons, full nerve bundle. Then notice what's down here in the posterior pituitary. The terminals, which we know store and release neurotransmitter. That these are going into the circulatory system, the capillaries. So the posterior pituitary just does what? It what? It receives the neurohormones and releases them. It receives them from a part of the body, a hypothalamus. They get vesiculated, transported, stored, and then only when these nerve cells cross their threshold, they'll generate an action potential. It'll trigger the release of our neurohormones. So is there any hormone producing ability in the posterior pituitary? No. Not at all. What questions do you have about the anatomy? Relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. That's right. They don't make them, they just store and release. Or the posterior pituitary just stores and releases. Two types of neurohormones. Now in your textbook, it's always shown the anterior pituitary on the left side, posterior pituitary on the right side. Does that mean anything, left, right? Yeah, they're called front and back, right? So I could turn this way, and this would be the same orientation of my body. But someone else could draw those anterior, posterior. So don't just say it's always on the left, it's always on the right. You need to find those axon terminals to tell you which lobe you're at, or which part you're at. You see axon terminals in the pituitary, you're at the posterior pituitary. Let's now contrast that to the relationship of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So it looks like figure 6.4 will show you. Should be able to see something pretty different right now. Let's see a vein where? In the what? I can't hear you. Even before then. Infundibulum, right? What else is different?
Blood supply.
There's a lot of blood supply. There's an endocrine cell in the anterior pituitary. What else are you picking up? Yes, the endocrine cell in the anterior pituitary. What else? Infundibulum. Very good. She said the hypothalamic nerve cells don't go all the way through the infundibulum. Notice how they terminate in the hypothalamus. Its neurotransmitters go into the bloodstream. So now we could say they're actually neurohormones. Yep, there's a couple more capillary beds. Because we've got to transport hormone, neurohormone from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and then release a whole other set of hormones from the anterior pituitary.
So this one does secrete hormones.
Yes. The anterior pituitary does produce its own hormones. We're going to see 6 different hormones from the anterior pituitary being made and released from here. So the hypothalamus, we noted secretes, we're going to call them trophic and have hormones. You really could say neurohormones. Trophic hormones from the hypothalamus go into a local what? Circulatory system. It's actually called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. The blood circuit between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. We're going to see 7 tropic hormones from the hypothalamus control 6 hormones from the anterior pituitary. So I might as well mark that so we're not confused later. There's 7 different tropic hormones from the hypothalamus that target the what? Targeting the, remember, target is a anterior pituitary. So these tropic hormones, like if we're in lab today, what tropic hormone is released by the hypothalamus to target the anterior pituitary? What comes with the hypothalamus? TRH. Is that what you're saying, Brianna? Yeah. Okay, I couldn't hear. I was hearing S. Sorry, you were right. thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus goes into this hypothalamal hypophyseal portal system to target the anterior pituitary to release another hormone called TSH. Very good. Thyroid stimulating hormone. That's one example. Right? We got 6 more we will go through next week. So tropic hormones from the hypothalamus go into the portal system, targeting the anterior pituitary to release its hormones into the general circuit. So you might want to come back to this as a road mark. When you get confused in the anterior pituitary, come back and say, oh yeah, this has to go here and this. And then we have a whole other pathway on this. Any questions about the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary before we look back in a little bit better detail of the posterior pituitary? Anterior pituitary is made up of what type of tissue? What's not in here? There are no nerves. Right? And we've got epithelial, right, our endocrine cells in here. And I would just say endocrine glands. Anterior pituitary is glandular. Posterior pituitary is neural, nerves. The organ itself, right, not its, that one is control. Posterior pituitary is just axon terminals. Anterior pituitary is endocrine gland. All right. So the proper name for the for the posterior pituitary is the Neuro Hypothesis, and that prefix neuro gives you an idea, right? It should give you an idea. It has something to do with nerves, and it's just axon terminals of our hypothalamus. We identified through our image description earlier that the posterior pituitary doesn't make any hormones, but it releases them. And the 2 hormones, neurohormones that it releases, includes a hormone called oxytocin and another one called antidiuretic hormone. Your book will call it vasopressin, and we'll clarify that later. I'm sorry? The OT is the abbreviation.
in the antidiuretic.
And I do have a typo. I will fix that.
Okay.
Yep. I should not work at night at home. I will fix that. Thank you. Not anti, no, that's a new word. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH. What we'll do is we'll get into the pathways next week, but before I do that, I want to caution you, you can abbreviate the hormones. If you rely strictly upon the abbreviations, you're going to get lost and confused and not be able to make the connection. So what I want you guys to do is learn the names. Once you learn the names, that's going to help you a lot more than the abbreviation. A lot of the hormones tell you what they do, like antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that, anti means water. Antidiuretic.
Okay.
It holds water in the body. Okay. Do what? Your urine output would go down with the antidiuretic hormone.
Water.
Output, yeah. Okay. So lessons and so if I said antidiuretic hormone, I already had an idea. Something to do with water in the kidneys. If I just said ADH, you're gonna go, you're crazy, right? If I said thyroid stimulating hormone that stimulates the, okay, yeah. So learn those instead of TSH, TRH, whatever. You'll go crazy otherwise. We don't want you to do that. Okay. We're going to conclude our discussion here.